On this occasion, nobody got arrested, nobody went to jail, and that opened the Pandora's box. Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. This time, it's another in my occasional series looking at previous Liberal Democrat Party leaders with Lib Dem History Group founder Duncan Brack. Welcome back to the show, Duncan.
Thank you very much for having me again.
I hope you have got your flared trousers on as we're taking a journey back to the 1970s and beyond even. So having done Charles Kennedy in our last show, this time we're looking at Jeremy Thorpe, a name who will be familiar, maybe notorious even to many listeners, but also a name before a good number of our listeners were born, I think we have to face up to, Duncan. So let's start with a quick summary. Who was Jeremy Thorpe? What did he do?
So, Jeremy Thorpe was MP, Liberal MP for North Devon from 1959 to 1979. He was leader of the Liberal Party from 1967 to 76. And in that position, he oversaw the second post-war Liberal revival after the first one in the kind of late 50s and early 60s fizzled out, and managed to achieve votes of almost 20% in the two elections in 1974. The February 74 election was ended in a hung parliament, and there was a brief discussion of a possible coalition with the Conservatives. Where have we heard this since? But in fact, that wouldn't have had a majority, so it didn't come to anything. And then his political career was brought to an end with his resignation as leader in 76 and being defeated in his constituency in 79 after a rather sordid and grisly personal affair hit the headlines, which no doubt we'll go into in some detail.
And hit the courtrooms as well.
Indeed, absolutely. He was accused of conspiracy to murder, but found innocent of it.
As he is dead, I can safely go on to point out that after his acquittal, one of the jurors from the jury that acquitted him did a piece in, I believe it was the New Statesman, if I remember correctly, explaining how they all thought he was guilty, but just not of the thing that they'd been asked.
Yes, I think that's probably accurate.
In a brilliant establishment response to that, it was then made illegal for jurors to go around saying such things after games. But let's go back to the beginning of that political career. You said the second Liberal revival. The first was under Joe Grimmond, who we've covered in an earlier episode, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes for people. What triggered the second Liberal revival? Was it all about Jeremy Thorpe and his brilliance, or was it the Times, or some particular event?
So I think it was the Times primarily, but Thorpe was well positioned to benefit from it. I think he had shortcomings as a leader. There's never been a perfect leader of the party. I think some people came close, but he wasn't one of them. So you can criticize him. But one thing he was always good at, he was a stylish performer. He was a very good communicator, excellent speaker, good at using television, which was becoming more common as a medium of communications. And he attracted attention to the party when the political environment gave it a chance to grow. And really, this was disillusion with the way in which British economy was gradually going downhill. A very unpopular Conservative government in the early 70s, 70 to 74, including kind of a rapid reversal of its position in the middle of the Parliament when it ran into economic problems. Labour was still, the main opposition party, but it didn't look terribly attractive. You began to see all the first signs of the infighting and the attempt to take over by the left that became much more obvious later in the 70s and early 80s. So the Liberal Party just began to seem like a more attractive alternative. And you had a good, stylish, charismatic leader at the head of it.
And I think that stylish point is one that's, in a way, quite hard to convey, but is illustrated brilliantly by some of the photos of him from the time, such as there's a wonderful one, and I'll include a link in the show notes to some of the Getty Images photos from the time. But there's a wonderful photo of him holding a violin where he just looks really cool and stylish. Imagine your most trendy current actor. And imagine the way they would hold a violin compared to what it would look like if, say, there was a photo of me holding a violin. There was a certain, and likewise, there are some fantastic photos of him with rock and music stars of the time, where again he just looks naturally at home, doesn't he?
He was a showman. He was a performer. He liked performing. That became obvious at, I think, school at Eton and at university at Oxford. And he had an eye for a good publicity opportunity. There's a great photo in the biography of him by Michael Block, which is well worth reading. When he, as MP for North Devon, he volunteered to look after one of the village post offices for a week in the summer so that the postmaster and his family could go off on holiday, which they otherwise weren't able to do. So you got a great picture of him wearing, actually, I think he's still wearing a three-piece suit, though he's taken off the jacket, sweeping the pavement outside the post office. Clearly, I mean, just perfect. How is that for a local MP's publicity
Yeah.
opportunity?
He would be able to eat a bacon roll in style, and he
No
had to
problem
start
at all.
doing so.
Absolutely.
But before he got to the heights of his success, his first election as leader was actually somewhat of a failure. So perhaps we should start there with the 1970 election and what went wrong and why he survived it as leader.
Yeah, so it used to be common wisdom, accepted wisdom at the time that basically Liberals lost power, lost votes under Labour government. And the 1970 election was after 6 years of Labour government under Harold Wilson, who'd won a small majority in 64 and then a much bigger one in 66. Um, Grimond had stood down in early on in that parliament. Thorpe had taken over, but as usual with British post-war governments, the government began to run into economic problems, and it seemed to be that the Conservatives were the obvious alternative. One problem with Thorpe was that he was a good performer, but he didn't always have much content to deliver. He wasn't, unlike Grimond and unlike Ashdown, for example, he was never really interested in policy. What he liked talking about was international relations, which was important later in the 70s, and I'm sure we'll go on to the European Communities Bill. But at the time, it was talking about apartheid in South Africa and decolonization process in Africa and things like that. It's kind of what he liked talking about. Important issues, it's a good liberal heritage there, but it wasn't really addressing the main problem that voters were concerned about. So actually, in 1970, the vote didn't go down that badly I've got the figure somewhere. The problem was that the party lost most of its MPs, 7 out of 13. So the vote fell from 8.5% in the 1966 election to 7.5 in 1970, though there were more candidates. These were the days before the party fought all the constituencies in the country. So the more candidates, average vote per candidate fell from 16.1% to 13.5%. But more importantly, 7 out of the 13 Liberal MPs lost, and most of the remaining six only held on with really small majorities. I mean, it could have been much, much worse, actually.
Now, that average vote per candidate in 1970 is fascinating because that's almost the same as what the average Lib Dem vote per candidate was in the 2024 general election. Um,
Yes, but much more
and
evenly spread across the country.
with a massively different number of MPs. And I think this
Yeah.
is one of the things that is, I guess, an open question around how successful was Thorpe then in that 1970 Parliament. So the traditional story, which I think has a lot of merit, is that he really sees that opportunity to break through and put the Liberal Party on the map as not just a declining party that was still hanging around, but it was a thing from the past. It was just an odd quirk. There were a few liberals still popping up here and there, into a party that was nearly one of the big players in British politics, but certainly a very prominent force. The flip side is to look at the number of MPs elected and not the vote share. And if you judge that as the metric, it was all the elections that he fought as party leader were pretty underwhelming. So what's your and I think probably prior to July 2024, a lot of people would maybe have more sympathy with the vote share number as being an indicator of what a leader can achieve, whether a party is relevant or not. I think post July 2024, having shown so spectacularly as a party that seats and vote share are not really correlated at all for us as a party. The flip side of, say, previous failures where we've had high votes and low seat numbers. I think that Thorpe record looks a bit less impressive. But what's your take on that?
Well, yes and no. I mean, obviously, it is better if you're going to get an average vote share of, 12% of what we got and 72 MPs. This is obviously better than the vote of 19.3% in the 1974 election and 14 MPs. On the other hand, what the result for us in 24 means is that we almost don't exist in large parts of the country.
Mm.
People see our candidates coming fourth or fifth or losing their deposits. And it makes it much more difficult to expand beyond the areas
Yeah.
we've won. So the 74 vote, which had almost 20%, yes, too evenly spread across the country, but nevertheless, that was quite a marked thing about the election. I was just getting interested in politics at the time. Sadly, I was too young to vote in my school mock election, but the Liberals won my school at that time. It's the fourth, fifth, and sixth years, and the senior schools were allowed to vote. It just getting that vote share catapulted the party into much greater attention. People remembered we existed, thought that perhaps, this was a serious party. Yes, it then sort of fell away because there were so few MPs able to make arguments in the country and in the House of Commons. But don't look down on a strong vote share just because it doesn't deliver that many MPs.
Yeah, although I think the difference as well is one of the role of local government. So I would say that if you say, where does the party exist now? Actually, in many seats where we got a low vote share at the general election, there are nonetheless Liberal Democrat councillors in the area. And in that sense, the Liberal Democrats politically very much do exist. And you look at the proportion of the country which has Lib Dem councillors, that has been steadily rising again the last few years.
That's
But
true.
in Thorpe's time, as it were, the silver lining one might have hoped that a Thorpe fan would be able to argue on his behalf is, well, yes, okay, we got all of this vote share. It didn't turn into so many MPs, but look at this huge growth in local government. Now, although there was some growth in local government, it was almost despite Jeremy Thorpe, wasn't it? It wasn't part of his approach as a leader in the way that local government growth has been absolutely central, particularly to Paddy Ashdown and Ed Davies' focuses on how they've tried to help the party grow from low points.
Yeah, that's a curious bit of the story, really. I mean, you're absolutely right. So the Liberals, the Grimond revival in the late 50s and early 60s had seen quite a substantial increase in Liberal local government support, but that had gradually faded away throughout the 60s during the Labour government period. And it began to grow again during the 70s, but it's like it had nothing to do with Thorpe,
Mm.
really. And indeed, I don't think the growth in local government during the Grimond period had much to do with Grimond either. This was a period when the
Exactly.
Parliamentary Party didn't really understand local government. And of course, more local authorities then were run by independents, and it was less common for local elections to be fought by parties. I mean, that was becoming steadily more common, but there were still a lot of independents around. So it's kind of treated as a completely separate universe. The important things in the 70s that happened when Thorpe was leader, as I said, nothing much to do with him. The Liberal Assembly in 1970 passed the famous Community Politics Resolution, and with a growing interest in local government in the party, and particularly in the young Liberals, who were very strong at the time, you began to see Liberal local government successes. But yeah, really not connected to what the Parliamentary
Yeah.
Party was
And
doing
I
at all.
and I don't know if Thorpe actually voted for the community politics motion in the end, but certainly the impetus behind it was very much wanting to push the party in a different direction from the one the leader was taking, or maybe one should say a complementary direction. But it wasn't. It was a sense of we are rebelling against the leader in terms of wanting this different approach to politics, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he paid much attention to it, as far as
Mm.
I'm aware. It doesn't feature particularly in the biography. I suspect he just thought, he was never you would not rate him very highly at party management. He was not particularly engaged in the party's mechanisms. He liked giving speeches at conferences, assemblies, as they were then, and he gave very good ones. But I mean, that was about the extent of his involvement. Though he liked campaigning as well. I mean, he threw himself into by-election campaigns, for example.
So what happened then in February 1974, which was this big breakthrough, at least at a national vote share level?
Well, we might remember what happened from, I think, 72 onwards, in
Mm.
that the Liberal Party won a string of by-elections, five in total. I can see if I can remember them all. Rochdale, Sutton and Cheam, Ripon, Isle of Ely, and Berwick was the last one, Berwick upon Tweed, with Alan Beath, who then held the seat right up until 2015.
Mm.
Sutton and Cheam was one on a community politics kind of local focus type approach with Graham Tope, who's now, of course, a member of our Lord's Party, but all of the others weren't. It was kind of general disaffection with the government, Liberals in a strong enough position to be able to win. I guess Rochdale had some sort of local strength there. In general, good local candidates, or sometimes in the Isle of Ely, it was Clement Freud, who was a well-known TV and radio actor, broadcaster. So a kind of mixed bag, but you could sense, I remember actually, again, I was just getting interested in politics, and I remember seeing on the news, I think two Liberal by-elections either came on the same day or very close together. And my aunt and uncle were staying with us at the time. And I remember my uncle saying, "Ugh, they'll just lose them all at the election." And then my aunt said, "Don't say that to Arthur, who's my father, who was I didn't know this, but he was a Liberal voter at the time. And indeed, we did lose some of them. We hung on to others. But you could sense there was a crest of a wave going up to the 74 election, called by the government in less than ideal circumstances after a series of major strikes by workers, particularly power workers. Ted Heath, the Prime Minister, decided to call the election. I mean, he could have done another year and a half later, but he decided to call it on the basis of who governs Britain. Is it the trade unions or is it the government? And I remember a political commentator writing, if a prime minister has to ask the country that, the country is probably going to say, well, it's not you, mate. So ended up a hung parliament. So Conservatives got 37.9% of the vote and Labour 37.2, but Labour ended up with four seats more than the Conservatives. Liberals won 19.3%, more than 6 million votes, highest vote share ever, or highest vote number of votes ever up until then, and 14 MPs. Heath didn't resign straight away. I mean, he'd lost his majority, but Labour didn't have a majority themselves. And there was an attempt to put together a coalition. Thorpe was invited to talks in Downing Street. The trouble is, Conservatives plus Liberals still wouldn't have had the majority, and there were talks about getting the Ulster Unionists in, who had, I think, about 10 or 12 seats. And that wasn't a particularly attractive position. Thorpe was apparently offered the post of cabinet minister, and I don't think they specified what one it was. But Thorpe rightly held out for electoral reform. And of course, that became a really big issue in the 70s, such a disproportional election result. And all Heath would offer was a speakers' conference on electoral reform, which was clearly worthless. So that came to an end. Consultations with the party was then carried out after Thorpe's visit to Downing Street. And that kind of helped to undermine his position a bit, sort of looking forward to his resignation the following 2 years' time. He didn't consult with anyone before going to see Heath. His MPs learned about it from seeing it on the news or reading it in the media, which is not ideal party management. He did consult with them afterwards and with the party in the country, and basically it was a feeling that, well, Heath had called the election and lost. There was not a strong case for putting him back into power again, particularly as there was very little in it for the Liberals anyway.
Yeah, I used to take a very critical view of Thorpe's failure to consult with anyone. That for most people in the party, it was a sudden discovery that their party leader was off to, had gone to Downing Street, and understanding a very negative reaction. I guess I'm slightly more sympathetic now to that on the basis that in a world before email, before video conferencing, before even telephone conference calls, actually consulting a large number of people geographically disparate in a short period of time is just logistically really difficult. And I'm not sure if you or I were sat there in the room with Thorpe before he was heading off to Downing Street, what would we have told him to do instead first?
That's a fair point. I think I would have told him to phone his MPs or get someone to
That's a
phone
very
his
fair point.
MPs
Yeah,
and make sure they knew about it. And maybe, the party president and the chair of the
keep the
executive and
president in
stuff
the
like
loop, definitely.
yeah, and he didn't do any of that. So just the minimum level of consultation. I agree. You couldn't do it more widely than that before the invitation, but he
And
could have done a bit.
And I think there would have been uproar in the party anyway, even if he had done that, wouldn't there? That it's
Yeah,
and there's an indication there of, in a sense of that dilemma, that in a way there's normally in that sort of period when there's a hung parliament. We saw this in different circumstances post 2010. You often don't have that much time, and therefore you have to have properly prepared, discussed as necessary in advance, and it's very hard to do that without there being significant political cost, either because you're
yeah.
seen to be being presumptive, or you're seen to be being egotistical, or you are, encouraging the discussion of all sorts of topics which are not helpful for maximizing the number of seats and votes.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I think the way we handled the coalition negotiations in 2010 actually was a model. I think that worked really well. But as you said, it's a bit easier now. And of course, the negotiations then lasted for several days. So there were lots of opportunities for consultation.
Yeah. And the other notable thing about February 74, at least to election law geeks like myself, the other notable thing is that it was the birth of national election expenditure, in effect. So up until then, none of the political parties had done things like run national advertising campaigns, because the assumption was that those would be essentially illegal, that you would have to take the cost of the national campaign and divide it up by all of your different candidates, and that there weren't national things that you could do that fell outside constituency campaigns. And very much at Jeremy Thorpe's instigation, the Liberal Party ran a £10,000 national advertising campaign in February 74 to basically test the law. And on this occasion, nobody got arrested, nobody went to jail, and that opened the Pandora's box. And it opened a Pandora's box that I think it's fair to say ended up benefiting Labour and the Tories much more than the
Mm.
Liberals or then the Alliance and the Liberal Democrats. And when you and I interviewed Jeremy Thorpe, I think it was in 2009, I remember asking him about this, and his view was that, well, someone would have done it at some point
Mm.
anyway, and therefore better to do it first, which has some merit to it. Although, given that nobody had done it up till that point, I'm still not convinced it was the right gamble to take, particularly as although £10,000 then was obviously worth a lot more than it is now, that's still a fairly modest sum.
Mm. Very much. Yeah. That's interesting. I didn't know that.
So 1974 election, February 1974 election. Those who don't know what happens next may, however, be able to guess there's another election that
Mm.
year, given we emphasised February 74, results in a Labour minority government. And then what happens?
Yeah, so Liberals vote declined. We did fight almost all the seats, I think. I mean, they pushed up the number of candidates, but the vote fell overall to 5.3 million, 18.3%, 13 MPs instead of 14. Labour has a majority government. If anyone hasn't seen James Graham's play This House,
Mm,
it's set during this period, and then in the years that followed, and I totally recommend it. It's a brilliant play about politics in that period. So things begin to go off the ball. Now, are we going on to the downfall of Thorpe, or should we talk about some of his achievements? Because I think it's worth remembering the European
yeah,
Communities Bill.
absolutely. So, as you say, October 74, Liberal Party falls back. Wilson gets a proper-ish majority. It's a majority that's sufficiently small that subsequently, with by-elections and defections, Labour lose it at some point later in that parliament, but Wilson is back in post. So if you're looking at the end of 1974 at the state of British politics, you've got a Labour government with a small majority, a Liberal Party that's fallen a bit back from its vote share peak, but is a big player again in a way that it hadn't been for several decades. At a parliamentary level, it's still a very small party, and we're beginning to see some significant local government growth for the party, albeit that's not really connected to Thorpe. It's sort of coincidental that it's happening in parallel. But politics isn't just about elections and mechanics and tactics. It's also about policy and ideology. So, what's the stock take at the end of 74 looking like?
Well, I want to go back to 71, 72, if that's all right with you, because I think this is probably the key political thing that Thorpe did, or at least in terms of policy rather than elections or
Yeah.
anything like that. So the what happened was that the Heath government, after it got elected in 1970, decided to apply on behalf of the UK for entry to the European Economic Community, or the Common Market, as it was called then. This was, I think, the second. I can't remember if it's the second or the third attempt to apply. I think there was a growing realization amongst British policymakers that better integration with Europe made a lot of sense. It was partly an answer to Britain's economic problems, which indeed it was, or it was to prove to be after the UK joined the EEC. It was a logical consequence of decolonisation and British former imperial colonies becoming independent. The previous attempt or attempts had been turned down, vetoed by France, but there was a new French president in this period, so he thought there was a reasonable chance of an application succeeding. Now, this split both the major parties, Conservatives and Labour, as the European issue always does, actually, and it didn't split, happily, it didn't split the Liberal Party, as indeed that's usual for European issues as well. So in 1971, there was a vote in the House of Commons to open negotiations with the EEC. There was a Conservative rebellion against it. Heath did not have a large majority, and he would have lost or probably would have lost, if it hadn't been for the fact that Roy Jenkins, who was then Labour deputy leader, or I think he just resigned as Labour deputy leader, led 69 Labour MPs in voting against the three-line whip in their own party and in support of the government. So the vote passed, and the UK was able to start negotiations. That was, looking back at it, this was the kind of the beginning of what became the Social Democratic Party, the SDP, in 1981, because a lot of the Labour MPs who voted with Jenkins, pro-European Labour MPs, voted with Jenkins, many of them were later to join the SDP. of course, all that was later. But then the negotiations were concluded, and the House of Commons had to pass, or Parliament had to pass the European Communities Bill. And in that occasion, Jenkins went back into line, and his fellow support, I think there were a few rebels, but fellow supporters went back into line, voted against the government because, they're the opposition. They're trying to defeat the government, even though probably Jenkins would have supported the content of the bill. And the second reading of the European Communities Bill was passed with a majority of 8. And there were 5 Liberal MPs voting at the time with the government. If they had voted against, the bill would have fallen.
Mm.
And then, of course, the bill went through all stages, committee stage, report stage, third reading, and so on. And there were a lot of times when Liberal votes kept the government going, actually kept the government majority. And that is a major achievement, I think. The Liberal Party under Thorpe made the difference to whether the UK joined the EEC at the time. And indeed, then later on, 20 years later, of course, on the vote on the Maastricht Bill, the revision of the European Treaty, Liberal Democrat votes kept the government in support going at that point. So I think, we can be proud of our heritage there. And I think it's probably one of the most significant things Thorpe managed to do as leader.
Mm. And particularly because although we can never be sure about the what ifs of political history, although you have written edited several very good collections that
Indeed.
attempt to be confident about what ifs of political history. But although we can never be absolutely sure, it's plausible, isn't it, that had that bill failed and not gone through, firstly, that the rest of the European economic community would have soured on, well, look, you can't make up your minds,
Yeah.
etc., and may not have been enthusiastic about a new round of negotiations a few years down the track. But also, would a Labour Party under Wilson a few years later have been pushing to start up negotiations? I mean, as it was, what the path that Wilson took was to say, well, I'll renegotiate entry and have a referendum on the renegotiated terms. But I think the politics of that was quite finely balanced, wasn't it? And if the starting point for Wilson had been that Britain wasn't in Europe, would he really have taken? And if you then follow that through, you then think, well, at what point, would Mrs. Thatcher have been, who actually in her early days was more pro-European than in her latter days, but would she have really wanted to take Britain into Europe? And it ends up becoming, well, it's the thing that Tony Blair achieves maybe in 1997, isn't it? It's,
Yeah.
there are obviously some things where, as sadly, our party's experienced all too well in 2010 to 15, you might achieve something or block something, but all you're doing is is pushing the alternative happening a few years down the track. In this case, that feels like it was a much more significant decision, and it's one that might have taken decades to reverse had Liberal MPs decided to vote to sink the bill.
Yes, I think that's right, actually. And I think that's absolutely right. And also Liberal support for staying in the EU in the referendum I can never remember if it was 75 or 76. I think it was 75.
75, I think.
75, I think so. Again, Thorpe played a major role in that. And, actually, again, that helped the Liberal Party. I think seeing him alongside leading Labour figures like Roy Jenkins and pro-European Tories, again, cemented the picture, I think, that the 74 elections had painted of the Liberals being perhaps not quite as important as the other two parties, but a major player on the political scene as well. And again, that's to his credit that he played a leading role in the referendum campaign.
So I think, if you had been organising a fringe meeting at, say, a spring 1970 conference debating the merits of what Thorpe had or hadn't achieved as leader, the balance sheet would look pretty positive in terms of vote share. Number of MPs, not spectacular, but on the other hand, not gone horribly backwards either. And, although that you doubtless would find a speaker who would have a go at Thorpe over being, all showman and no substance, actually the defender of Thorpe on your panel would very reasonably be able to point to, look, getting us into the European Economic Community, you cannot get a more substantive policy achievement than that. And then it all goes wrong. But before we go on to how it all goes wrong, what are the other things that the critic would have thrown at Thorpe's record at that putative hypothetical fringe meeting?
Yes, indeed. So I think, as I said before, I think one can criticize Thorpe for not being a great party manager. He was Whereas I think all style and no substance is a criticism that kept on coming up. As I said, he was really only interested in international issues and he preferred to talk about that. Actually, one of his famous speeches at the Liberal Assembly before he became leader, and it was seen as a kind of bid for the leadership, advocated British bombers bombing the railway line from Mozambique to Rhodesia. Now, Rhodesia, ex-British colony, had just declared UDI, as they call it, a unilateral declaration of independence, to keep the white minority, kind of settler minority government in power to prevent Britain setting up a system where the black majority would have a view. And that was a major political issue in the late 60s, early 70s, eventually resolved after many years of fighting in the area. But Thorpe got his nickname of Bomber Thorpe
Mm.
from advocating British bombers, which, I mean, nobody was talking about using force at the time. They were talking about embargoes on oil imports and things like that. So it was a bit of a slightly interesting position to put. But yeah, he liked talking about international affairs. He liked meeting international leaders. He knew a lot of the post-colonial African leaders. He was barred, I think, from entering Rhodesia eventually. He was barred from entering Spain, actually, under Franco earlier on. He wasn't great at engaging with kind of domestic issues, and he was kind of maybe typical Eton and Oxford educated guy, very intelligent, not really interested in doing the work. So he would kind of, busk it and good at picking up a brief at the very last moment and performing that way. I think the other thing that people would point to was his secretiveness and inability or lack of desire to work closely with colleagues. He set up something called the Winnable Seats Fund. It's kind of an early form of targeting, and it had some impact. You can say a lot of the seats where support went in were eventually won, either in the 70s or perhaps later in the 90s by the party. It wasn't as the kind of sort of ruthless targeting of resources that we're used to now, but it was an early attempt to do that. But he kept personal control of the fund, and he was quite secretive about where money came from to fund it. And he was just people who dealt with him often ended up actually not trusting him. He had a bit of an image of untrustworthiness, slipperiness, that kind of thing. Again, it comes out really well if you read the Michael Block biography. And that, as much as the personal scandal, which I guess we're about to talk about, that really undermined his support in the parliamentary party in particular, who of course dealt with him on a daily basis. He remained pretty popular in the party at large until the scandal broke. But of course, they didn't deal with him all the time. They just saw his speeches at conference or campaigning in by-elections. A bit like Kennedy,
Yeah.
Charles
So I can
Kennedy in
just
that way.
imagine at this hypothetical spring 75 fringe meeting, the panelists making the pro Thorpe case, easily winning
Yeah, totally.
the sort of show of hands, the people in the room, and the Liberal MP sat at the back muttering, only these fools knew.
Yes, absolutely right.
But members do get to see the rather more problematic, sordid side of Thorpe in the subsequent years. So what is this scandal that we have alluded to several times?
Okay, so the problem was that Thorpe was homosexual or gay, as we would call it now, and this was in the period, of course, before homosexual relations were legalized, which happened in the mid to late 60s, didn't it? But he had a lot of homosexual encounters. I mean, he's also got married twice. His first wife was killed in a car accident, and apparently they're very, very happy marriages. So bisexual, I guess we would call him. But he had a whole string of homosexual encounters from starting probably from school, certainly at university, and all through his life. And some of the details you read again in the biography are just jaw-dropping. it, I think it's a feel that he liked risk. He liked sort of running risks and getting away with it. But he would have casual homosexual encounters. He'd pick up rent boys on streets in London. He'd write them letters on House of Commons headed notepaper saying how much he'd enjoyed having a relationship with them. It's amazing, actually, he got away with it for so long. But he didn't get away with it with the Norman Scott affair. So in 1961, he met a groom, a guy called Norman Joseph, who later changed his name to Scott. And Thorpe always denied that there was a homosexual encounter, but almost certainly there was. So they were together, or they had casual relations for a few years, but then Thorpe broke it off. But the trouble is, Scott wouldn't let go of it and kept on threatening to expose Thorpe. And remember, as I said, relations at the time were illegal. And a series of attempts were made to keep him quiet, including Thorpe helping Scott find work and accommodation. And from 1966, his fellow Liberal MP Peter Bessel made regular payments to him, basically to keep him quiet. But trouble is, Scott wouldn't keep quiet. Now, I mean, the way I phrase it at the moment, you can perhaps sound as though you feel sorry for Scott. He was perhaps badly treated by Thorpe and then sort of discarded. But actually, again, reading the biography, the lengths to which Scott went to try and drag Thorpe down really destroy any sympathy you might feel for him. He kind of made increasingly wild allegations. He claimed that Thorpe had stolen his national insurance card, which meant he couldn't get work, which is nonsense. Thorpe made lots of attempts to help him through friends, started in jobs. Scott would do them for a few weeks and then just give up and stop again. He moved to Thorpe's constituency eventually and just went to pubs and talked to anyone who would listen about the relations he'd had with Thorpe and apparently Thorpe's, persecution of him. He clearly had mental health problems. In fact, I think there were several suicide attempts. Didn't have much effect on the constituents, actually, who just thought he was this kind of random, balmy person. But the problem was, and in fact, if Thorpe had just let it go at that, possibly none of this would ever have happened. But Thorpe got increasingly paranoid. You can't entirely blame him. And what happened? So allegedly, and actually, I think this is actually what happened. A friend of Thorpe, David Holmes, found an assassin, a guy called Andrew Newton, an airline pilot, was found through a sort of string of contacts to basically, well, and this is where it becomes not clear whether actually Newton was hired to kill Scott or whether he was hired just to frighten off Scott. But what actually happened was in October 1975, he met up with Scott in North Devon. He drove Scott and his dog Rinka to Exmoor, to an isolated place on Exmoor, stopped the car, threatened to shoot Scott. Either the gun jammed, which is possible because it was an old pre-First World War gun, or Newton pretended it had jammed and couldn't go through with it, and drove off. So obviously Scott was left with a dead dog in the middle of Exmoor. Eventually, even that could have gone quiet, however, but in January the following year, 76, Scott himself appeared on court on charges of defrauding Social Security payments and then made claims against Thorpe, reported because it was made in court, it could be reported. And then Newton was eventually tried and convicted for the attack on Scott in March. And then in May 76, Thorpe is still leader at the time, Peter Bessel, who'd stood down in 1970 and was a businessman who was increasingly under trouble. His businesses were all failing. So he sold this story to the press, basically turned from a friend of Thorpe to an antagonist. Thorpe then attempted to preempt this by publishing his own version, big piece in the Sunday Times, including his letters to Scott. And some of them are just cringingly. The one that was most quoted was something like, this is Thorpe writing to Scott, bunnies must and will go to France. Bunnies was a nickname for Scott. And it's just, you can imagine the sort of tide of embarrassment that everybody felt at the time. I was just thinking probably I might be a liberal. I thought I was a liberal, but I just wish all this wasn't happening. So basically, his fellow MPs put pressure on Thorpe, just saying this is just distracting everything from the party. It's breaking us down. You could see the Liberal vote falling in opinion polls, beginning to do quite badly in by-elections. So on 9th May 1976, Thorpe finally resigned as Liberal leader. And then to finish the story, so Newton was released from jail the following year, April 77, and he claimed straight away that he had been hired to kill Scott. Thorpe held a press conference, which he admitted that he had had a relationship with Scott, which he'd always previously denied. Bessel accepted immunity to act as a prosecution witness and stupidly signed a contract with the Telegraph in which he would be paid money for his story, but he would be paid more if Thorpe was convicted, which, of course, Thorpe's defense lawyers made a big deal of at the
And
trial.
I always think the Telegraph gets off quite lightly
totally,
from that because the Telegraph lawyers surely should have and must have known that offering a contract to a witness in a criminal prosecution on those terms was basically endangering the criminal prosecution. There's a story about why the Telegraph signed off on that seems to be missing from the accounts that I've read. That maybe it's partly just because much of the accounts are written by the media, and the media isn't wanting to look too closely at its own role. But it just that I don't know if you've got any sense of why the Telegraph thought that was ever a reasonable contract to offer.
No, I don't think it's mentioned in the biography. I mean, the fact that it happened to mention, but there's no kind of interrogation of why they thought that was a good idea, which clearly it wasn't. So in the end, Thorpe was charged with conspiracy to murder, along with David Holmes and two others. And the trial began on 8th May 1979, just a few days after Thorpe lost his seat in the 1979 election. He was defended by George Carman, who was then a rising barrister, later a very famous legal figure, who just took apart the credibility of Bessel and Scott and kept Thorpe out of the witness box, which is probably helpful. The judge and the judge's summing up is worth reading just for a laugh. Basically, he described Norman Scott as a crook, a liar, a whiner, a parasite, a fraud. And again, kind of saying that it sounds a bit unfair, but actually reading what Scott was doing, I'm not sure it was unfair. So the jury acquitted Thorpe and his co-defendants
And
in
that
June
judge's
of
summing up
1970.
was the subject of a very famous Peter Cook
A sketch.
sketch
Yeah,
lampooning it,
absolutely.
because whether that was a fair or not description, the problem with the judge's summing up was it was very, very lopsided, and became, I think, a little bit notorious as an example of the establishment, in a sense, looking after its own. A member of the establishment, Thorpe, on trial, another member of the establishment, the judge, gives a very, very
Yeah.
favourable. And I think the combination of that and the skill of George Carman and the problem with the Bethel contract means that subsequently it's not unreasonable to look back on that and say that although Thorpe was acquitted, it's not a done deal that he was genuinely innocent.
Yes, I think that is true, actually. Yeah, actually, if you read the whole of the the judge's summing up, he's clearly trying to cover his back. He spoke of Scott's amazing lies and his predatory and dishonest behavior, concluding he is a crook, he is a fraud, he's a sponger, he's a whiner, he's a parasite. But of course, he could still be telling the truth. Well, no, not really. Not if you listen to what the judge has just said. Yes, I think the problem was, and again, it's all in the Block biography. I mean, Thorpe did know about this. He possibly didn't know all the details, but he clearly was aware that this was happening. He was the instigator. He kept on saying, will nobody rid me of this troublesome Scott? He channeled money, which was supposed to go to the party, to David Holmes to pay for the expenses of paying Newton and so on. So clearly, yes, in that sense, he was guilty. I think it was never established whether he really wanted Scott murdered or he just wanted Scott out of his life. So that's probably the remaining area of doubt. But yeah, I mean, clearly he was implicated and
And
he
and
should
as
have
I
been
said at the
guilty of something.
beginning, one of the jury members who subsequently went public took the view, and I don't think there's any reason to doubt that they were reflecting accurately what the
Yeah,
jury as a whole thought, that we thought he was guilty of something, just not the thing that we were
yes,
being
I think
asked to
I think that's accurate.
make a judgment on.
Anyway, that was the end of his political career, basically. Pretty much. I mean, he stayed involved a little bit in local politics. He became president of the North Devon Liberals and later Liberal Democrats, and helped Nick Harvey get elected in 1992 to that seat. And I remember actually, I was aide to a debate in the 1997 Lib Dem conference when we were passed a note saying Jeremy Thorpe has entered the conference. And Tom McNally, I think, who was chairing at the time, announced that to conference and they gave him a standing ovation. So kind of, time heals all wounds kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure it reflects that well on conference attendees, that given everything that was known about Thorpe at that point, that people gave him a standing
I
ovation.
think a lot of the details have probably faded into the mist of history.
That's a generous view. A generous view. We should also say he did actually still try to stand at the set. Well, he did stand at the 1979 general election, but
Yes, yes,
lost
absolutely.
his seat.
Yeah, for a bit he contemplated standing again later. But the other thing that happened to him was that he developed Parkinson's disease and became steadily. He actually lived a long time. I think one of the doctors said he'd never met anyone with Parkinson's who'd survived so long after I think the symptoms became evident in 1979. He didn't die until 2014, but he was increasingly, incapable of doing anything much anyway.
So, what does that leave as the overall verdict on Jeremy Thorpe, do you think?
He came over for most of his leadership as a stylish, progressive, and popular politician. He achieved a vote that the Liberal Party had never before won, percent. He helped drive general legislation taking Britain into the European community through Parliament, and he made the difference. But in the end, there wasn't enough substance underneath it. He was a good performer, but there wasn't much content. And I think probably the scandals in his private life or his the way in which he kept on having clandestine
Mm.
affairs, partly because he was a risk taker. I think he loved being not just the center of attention, but he loved kind of having things hidden behind him. Eventually that undid him, but also it made him behave in a kind of secretive and non-collaborative way that actually undermined his support in the parliamentary party.
Mm. And also, I think he fundamentally didn't have a plan for winning political power beyond be as popular as possible nationally.
Yes, I think that's true.
And
Yeah.
in that sense, his approach to politics was the sort that maybe better suits a leader of the Labour or the Tories, where, in a way, what is the key objective in that sense for Keir Starmer or Kemi Badenoch at the moment? Well, national popularity sort of gets you to where they want to be, whilst for the Lib Dems or other challenger parties, as we have seen with other leaders since, it's possible to carve out a much more successful route that involves thinking about the role of local government or target seats, or whatever. Though, as you say, we should acknowledge that in some ways, Thorpe did get the ball rolling on targeting with his target seat.
Yes, I think that's true. And it's curious actually, because I was about to say he never had much interest in party organization. He never kind of threw himself into the details of making sure the party was organized well in the country. But actually, he did do that in his own constituency. I mean, he was selected in 52 for a seat where we were in the, I can't even remember, we were in second or third place. I mean, there was Liberal support a long time in the past, but it's a very big rural seat. He managed to establish Liberal branches in almost all the villages,
Mm,
which is like I think over 300. He had a very good agent, which probably helped, but he really looked after his organization in his own constituency. He never seemed interested in
mm.
trying to sort of spread that out to the rest of the country, which is
Yes, I
curious.
think there was an assumption probably that it was a matter of random luck whether
Hmm.
somebody would pop up somewhere with the ability to do that. And therefore, if they did, you should welcome it. But it wasn't something that, as a leader or as a party, you could somehow organize to incubate more examples of in a way that now we would very much think of, yes, you can try to incubate more such seats and more such organization.
Yeah, I guess that's right. And he was also quite kind of taken with the idea that it's big personalities that make the difference.
Mm.
Who the candidate is much more important than anything else. And you could see that in some of the by-elections with Cyril Smith and Rochdale and Clement Freud in Isle of Ely. They were really big characters, charismatic figures. I guess he
I
thought that was
think
more
the
important.
trio of those three names, though, given what we know about all three of them since, shows also the very big, very real downside of that big personality based approach
Indeed,
to
indeed,
politics.
absolutely. And actually, it was the other three by-elections, Berwick with Alan Beath, Ripon with David Ostick, and Sutton-on-Cheam with Graham Tope, that perhaps are more about actually local strength and
He did.
local
And I say
campaigning.
this not only because Alan and Graham are now colleagues of mine in the House of Lords, but they are impressive characters in very, very different ways.
Yes, absolutely. I
Very
didn't
different
mean to say
trio.
they were
Yeah,
insignificant, but yes, quite a different type of character, type
yeah,
of candidate, actually.
yeah. And there is a well stomach churning really given the behaviour of the people involved. Liberal Party political broadcast from the early 70s, which features Thorpe, Cyril Smith, Clement Freud, and
Mhm.
Jimmy Savile. And you just that
Great.
there is something about that personality approach to politics that we should definitely recoil from. But let's look for one final, maybe more positive tip or lesson that you would take from Thorpe's career for current Liberal Democrats, Duncan.
I think it is. So we try to address this actually in our book, British Liberal Leaders, which of course I recommend to
Mm.
people, and of course it has a chapter on Thorpe. But we try to analyze what was good about leaders and what the necessary characteristics were. And the one where Thorpe really scored quite well is communications. You're always struggling for any coverage in as a Liberal or Liberal Democrat leader, and the ability to grab the headlines and to communicate and to develop your own kind of charisma is really important. So I think Thorpe scores pretty well on that. Communication and campaigning skills was the thing that we rated them on. But the other characteristics, ability to develop and articulate a vision, don't think he was great on that. Party management, he was terrible. and then, you could say left the party in better or worse shape than he found it. Actually, he left it in a better shape than he found it. He took over in 67 when the party was at a real low ebb. And he boosted it in the popular media, the popular image. He was dragging it down by the time he resigned, which is why he resigned. But actually, he had a major impact on how people saw the Liberal Party.
Mm. And on that note, thank you very much, Duncan.
Pleasure.
Listeners can find Duncan on Blue Sky at duncanbrack.bsky.social and the Liberal Democrat History Group, which has loads more about Thorpe and all of his predecessors and successors at liberalhistory.org.uk. Or you can find me on Blue Sky at, on this occasion, nobody got arrested, nobody went to jail. And that opened the Pandora's box, markpackuk.bsky.social, or my email newsletters at libdemnewswire.com. Do look out in the show notes for follow-up links to what we've discussed, including my account of the interview Duncan and I did with Jeremy Thorpe in 2009, including how he brought a crisis down on Amnesty International and some very fun emergency AGM procedural shenanigans that followed from that. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening.